Hello, a nice day to everybody, and welcome to the sixth conversation of our Minor Universality group. Today it is our pleasure to talk with the writer and cultural theorist Adania Shibli, whom I welcome very warmly. Hello, it is great to see you, Adania.
Hello.
It is such a pleasure to see you back. We're linked in many ways since years now in literary and intellectual activities, and I'm, for instance, thinking back to a conference on Europe's borders in 2018, where we shared at the Literary Colloquium Berlin a great discussion with Matthias Enar and Senturan Varataraja on how to write world in a post-Orientalistic era. And one of the questions was whether the post was to be put into question. So I've been writing for the first volume of our new series, Rhinoceros, Europe in Transition, which has just been published and is dedicated to the enormous problem of repair. And you are also, of course, part of the Minor Universality Artists in Residence program, which we pursue together with Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin. And our encounters in this context also generated the idea to have this conversation on universalism and narration. So now that being represented is, in a Saïdian meaning, political, biography of course always is, and you have been so prolific, which makes it impossible to do justice to your intellectual vita, but please allow me nonetheless, as it has become a small tradition of this video series, to very briefly introduce you and your work. So you were born in Palestine and you are a writer. You have written novels and plays and short stories and narrative essays for which you have received prizes. So for instance, twice the Katan Young Writers Award in 2001 and 2003. Your latest novel, Tafsil Thanawi, from 2017, certainly a major success, translated as Minor Detail with Fitzcarraldo in the United Kingdom and New Directions in the USA in 2020, which is our this book, which I hold in hand, was listed for the International Booker Prize and shortlisted for the National Book Awards last year. Entangled with your literary writing, which is also translated with Actes Sud in France, you are engaged in academic research as you hold a PhD in Media and Cultural Studies from the University of East London. And whilst you were a lecturer at the School of Critical Theory and Cultural Studies at the University of Nottingham from 2005 to 2009, you have also been invited to École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris in 2008 and as a postdoctoral fellow to Wissenschaftskolleg at Berlin in 2011-12. And for many years now, you keep teaching part-time at Birzeit University in Palestine. So coming from biography, let me start our conversation with a biographical question, or a question that considers our lives, and with the entanglement of life experience and writing, a relation that was certainly central for Edward Saïd. So your writing is political in many ways. It is marked by the experience of life in the occupied territories, and is also always marked by an experience of fundamental loss. This brings me to the question to know how our experiences are linked to the greater social world. Is narrating something that leads readers into a world of its own, singular, idiosyncratic even maybe? Or does it allow rather to widen concrete settings towards a shared experience?
Yeah, I think the starting point is the generosity possible by language itself and what it allows, when I think life itself doesn't allow these possibilities. So maybe it's too idealistic to not true, but it is how it feels like. Actually, the literature and writing is almost a parallel to life. It's completely, it can crosses with it, but not in ways that we can dictate or we can foresee, as it has its own rhythm, exactly as life has its own rhythm and unfolding. Maybe I can differ with you on the idea that my writing is political. It is writing. It is shaped by many forces. And also in terms of the narrative as an idea, because I think it comes from an opposite experience, linguistic experience, and this is the impossibility to narrate. What do you do with language if you cannot narrate, or if you are failing to narrate, or your language is punctuated by violence that it experiences? Because violence is not an experience only physical or in nature or on the mind, but it is always on the language itself. So I think my personal experience is a personal experience with language itself that brought me to writing. And I remember actually the first moment when I wrote, like exactly that you hold a pen and you write, and in this moment there is a creation, there is of its own. And I think I wrote wrong that time. I was a small kid, but it was perceived as wrong by others. But for me, it was beyond a judgment of right or wrong. It was how I came to writing. And I think since then I've been writing wrong. And wrongness also brought me to writing, almost this kind of, not exactly not fitting, but finding that there is something that language and literature can offer and share that life itself is incapable of. So I wonder if this is a personal experience or does it extend itself beyond the personal? And maybe this is also sometimes what we as readers find in literature, this space that extends, where almost we lose the recognition of the self and the other. It becomes a combined experience, or an experience that doesn't require differentiation. You read, you write, and there is a whole absence of who you are at that moment. It takes over you. And in that sense, I often say that language is alive because it has its own setup of relations and relation to time and relation between words, and those who read them in silence, those who write them in silence.
Thank you so much. You you start from language, which is really interesting for me, because when I was thinking about our conversation, I was thinking form very strongly, because the last debate we had was about the novel, and you were raising now also this idea of literature, which often is linked to the novel, very in our time certainly, and also the novel is a form that you use a lot in these processes you described, right? To find a way of expressing something, to say something. And I was wondering, as the novel is the great form of our times, but certainly the form coming from the 19th century, and often we think, when we say novel, we think of the great novel of the 19th century, right? Like Flaubert and Balzac and Stendhal and others. And those were projects in which an individual parcours was presented in order to say something about a greater collective or an experience of time, right? In this idea that you can, through an individual destiny, describe something like the destiny of a nation or the destiny of a society, or give a great panorama of something. And then also, of course, this idea of the novel was universalizing itself so strongly because it was linked to the idea of nation. It certainly was also linked to the idea of an imperial nation, which the European nations then more and more got in the 19th century. So I was also wondering about this novel and the form of the novel, because then on the other side, thinkers like Jacques Rancière have said that the novel was exactly the counter-history to the great novel of the nation, right? To the great telling or narrative of the nation, saying that in the novel you could express something individual or democratic or republican that was exactly dismissed basically after 1789 in this great idea of the nation. So I was wondering how you look at the form of writing and more specifically at the novel. Is it something that has for you an emancipatory force to be able to start from this individual or to say something? I'm also thinking about the fact that nowadays the novel has been used so widely in the world everywhere and has been changed and modified and rewritten and also in its form. Or would you say that the novel is something that still makes us stick to a certain European idea of the individual and the nation and the world we produce from that? And is it time to find other ways of dealing with forms? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle a lot with the history of the novel, let's say. And there's a specific history that you're also referring to, which is also the time when the idea of universality appeared. And I think just looking at it, it's basically adopting a certain view or relation to the novel. I don't think, for me, the novel is a form that is not static. And I would say as it can also combine a struggle, as it can embody a struggle. On the one hand, it has an authority, but how this authority becomes, let's say, a tender and intimate authority rather than an authoritarian authority, that it comes with its tools and demands and this idea of a narrative structure, almost adapting its movement, of linear movement from the same or parallel to history. And exactly as I have my struggle to history and its elimination, what kind of one specific of a form of a novel is eliminating. And I think this struggle, what attracts me a lot with a novel as a form, because I kind of my exploration and life with a novel is really alive, as I say it. It unfolds as I live, and it accompanies as I live, which is it kind of try to, or even stutters with how to move in life, how to move in itself. Probably it is the experience of many writers approaching the novel. But I think it's also, in my case, I'm very interested in the gaps and in the silences and in the relationship between what is written and what is not written, and how they both can create a relationship within the text itself. I don't think it's a counter history. I think maybe it is almost a thread of what history wants to present as a complete canvas or while history kind of eliminates that. And I, it was very interesting to go back to read Saidiya Hartman, or to go back recently, but to be frank, I only recently discovered her works. Maybe I'm a late comer to that, like 2 years ago. It was actually when we were trying to edit the novel. So we had a meeting with a publisher, and we thought we would have a few hours, 4 or 5 hours, that we go over all of the novel. What we managed to do was 3 pages. And I was wondering why. And we didn't realize this. We were doing that. We were engaging in that until we suddenly realized I have to leave to the airport. And for me, it was exactly this moment realizing that when a word is written, it is also written by the word that is not there. It's not in a relation of an opposition, but of a support. So I wonder how is history also coming within that, or the novel within this kind of relation of the grand narrative, if we want to call it the grand national narrative, because history has been also associated with the nation state and the linearity of time, a movement from a past to a present to a future. It is kind of connected, or, we would say that the nation state comes from this kind of plane or field of thinking. It lives from that. And on the way back to the airport, the publisher handed me a magazine where an interview was with Saidiya Hartman. And it was an amazing, because it's like all what you struggle with, all what you cannot articulate is suddenly being legitimized. And with her work, it's what kind of history will never touch upon. Because what about the silences? If we take her text, Venus, about trying to see history that betrayed this, Venus, that it does not include it in history, but there's a reference to Venus only through those who commit the crime, who subjugate her, who rape her, and who throw her in the ocean. And the question that Saidiya Hartman brings there and elsewhere is how we can relate to history that exclude us. So, and she proposes the fabulation or imagination as a possibility. And imagination is endless because everybody can imagine, and we can shift our imagination in every minute. So history becomes dynamic and a place that includes that which it will never include or think about. And in the same way, I would think also maybe the novel, the classical novel, the classical structure of a novel, the narrative structure, it's all the attempts to exclude and present this exclusion as complete, that you don't doubt it. There's a crime scene, that it's complete. It doesn't require anything outside it. Whereas I'm also thinking of the novel as a form that is possibly always inviting in that which excludes. And for me, this is my question. And this is where maybe in my last novel, I've been trying, I think I'm always kind of shaped by an absences or silences and mutings, and how to recognize that in the writing, which is the opposite almost of it's like how you can include an absence in a presence without this being dialectical or kind of the structural form of relation of one opposing the other or one requiring the other to define itself.
Thank you very much. I would like to follow up on Marcus' question and also what you said, to ask you about other possible forms of the novel. In your novel Minor Detail, you depict how lives are impacted by historical violence by immersing us in the details of these lives as they face the brutality of the world. How can the minor, as a prism, but also as a literary object, maybe change the novel?
It's, yeah. You know, when I wrote Minor Detail, it was never about history for me. It was really like, this is the first time I dared to look into the monster of the narrative structure in its eyes, until the narrative structure, with all my failures, I would like to play a game with you. And this game is to try to write you. And maybe in that sense, it kind of resonates with history. It demands maybe what some can call a historical event, because it is kind of playing with this narrative structure that I would say it's the cousin, the neighbor of history. In that there is the authority of the narrator, the all-knowing narrator, that is there, that it tries to present itself as not present and to try to be articulate. So it was trying to see if one who is powerless and one who has all the gaps can imitate the speech of the powerful and the tools of the powerful. To go back to the tool of the powerful is when it's about a narrative, so it's about history and it's about archives and what is included in these archives. In terms of, for me, not as an information, but as material, because for me, it really remains on a level of written words. My fascination with the archive, not in a reference to a truth, but how a truth is being brought to life through language and what absence is. And therefore, I think that was the event that is minor, not because it's minor, because it is defined by archives and history as minor. How can we relate to pain, a single pain, let's say? Is it, and of course it is, we need to treat it as minor, so we are also not too much affected by it and by many other things, because maybe we will be lost with this amount of pain that we can inflict. So how this pain can be dealt with in history and inflicted by history, because everything is about history. The history of Palestine, the history of Zionism, the connection of Zionism to the idea of nationalism, the idea now of trying to think beyond the national. So all these questions that they are related to the birth of history. But okay, if you lack all the tools, if history defined it as minor, what it is? Because at the end, it is it is the most major thing for the other minor. So we would say, like, it's an entry of a stutterer, of an anxious person into major history, but from a very minor entry, creating this minor literary work or minor literary investigation. Yeah. I don't know if this is clear or...
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to have your opinion about fear as a relatively universal emotion based on your novels. I'm still impressed by the way you told the story of fear in Minor Detail particularly. Minor Detail deals with different fears, such as fear of borders, fear of losing one's privilege, fear of strangers, fear of historical erasure. It also deals with effects such as destruction of any semblance of freedom, restriction of movement, curtailment of speech and expression, and death. It is, however, important to notice that this emotion is a condition that makes the exercise of courage possible in the novel. So my question, therefore, are, what is the importance of fear to you? Do you think there is a need to depart from our fear to rethink the relationship between humans and nature?
Yeah, actually, fear is a force for me. But a force for creativity. It's I kind of never experienced fear as something that prevents me from something. And then if your life is always engulfed by fear, and this is the life of the character, and actually both characters, because they both function within the domain of fear, but each is coming to it from a different place. The question, what do you do with fear? How it can be a transformative force in itself, so that fear doesn't produce fear only, but fear can produce almost a new path that is not dictated by the grammar of fear and how we experience fear as if it's something we need to protect ourselves from. And this is here we inflict pain, and this is the history of racism. You know, racism is built on fear. You are afraid from the other. And I think we have come to think a lot about fear in that sense, forgetting the possibility of fear as being an opener for, let's say, an indicator for something that we may confront and watch and go through. Actually, as a kid, I had this crazy exercise. We had, sometimes my parents left us alone. They went out in the evening. And everybody would be there in their room, but so the house would be dark and only the rooms are lit. And especially there was this room which was very dark, and I kind of felt that the monster lived there in that room. And specifically next to a column, there was a column, and it's in the living room. It was the least used space in the house. And maybe that's also where you think you're away from that room, not because your life is not there, but there is a different force. As a kid, this is what you feel. And so and on that column, there was the switch light, the light switch. So I would be in the dark, and my challenge is to go to that column and find the light switch. But as I walk there, I know I'm getting closer to the monster and also to the light switch that will tell me there's no monster. It was a very, I can still remember this path. towards the crime. It's about, don't think it's more than 2 meters that I needed to walk. But I kind of, it's almost kind of trying to confront fear that it's irrational, but there's also a joy in going through it and not leaving it prevent you from entering that room. And I always remember this experience whenever I have fear or experience fear. It's like how we can walk through it. And gently, we can do that. Gently. Or quickly, or however we feel. But not let it decide our relationship to the world or to places or to spaces or to experiences. Because each time I put the switch, the light switch on, I saw the room that it also contained something I liked a lot. There was this almost like stones from shells. And I loved how they looked in the light. So also it brought something, the opposite. It's kind of, and this, I think this transformative experience is important. And maybe it's a lot we experience on an emotional level, where sometimes we cannot control how it's unfolding. And also sometimes the fear from not being in control. It is something. And I think writing is fascinating because it is a process that doesn't involve control by any means. It's almost, for me, I would say, because I don't come to a work with clarity as what it is, but exactly from a feeling, often a joke. I write, I hear a joke, and there's something amazing in jokes because they bring our kind of rationality on its head, and it also makes us question rationality and bring it somewhere else. There's always one joke that is hidden behind a novel as the force, not a historical event, not pain, but a joke.
I think let us stay a bit longer on this question of fear and pain, collective pain and embodied pains. We just dive in a way, in a very concrete way. And to discuss today's epoch of universalism means also to discuss imperial politics, colonial structures, and the loss of cultural heritage. To speak about what a minor universality could be means perhaps to focus on the inherent violence of Western modernity. It's to speak about concrete experiences and stories, which is part of a very important part of your work for me. And it's also about reappropriation of cultural heritage and about strategies of repair, which perhaps your writing to me is a kind of strategy of repair. I would like to speak with you about your novel Planting Words, published in the first volume of Rhinoceros, where you examine such a case as a library of Khalil Sakakini. And perhaps you could tell us a bit more about this novel, about the strategies you propose as a writer and as also a political engaged citizen. And perhaps to start with the title, Planting Words, what does it mean to you? It's an entrance scene of sequence of the novel, a dream where you make this kind of a narrative essay on cultural loss.
Yeah, I would even connect it to a specific element of cultural loss. It's the linguistic loss of the language or the threat of that. When language is the world that you live in and the place that you feel more more alive, and it allows you and gives you life. What if this is being eliminated? And this is an experience I kind of think about in the context of Palestine, the occupation, and Israeli policies in relationship to language, and how these policies cause a sense of alienation from language itself, which is something, this is a violence. And I would connect that not only personally or in the context of Palestine, but all the losses that are being inflicted and forced on many, from the claim of universalism and colonialism. And I would like here to actually go back to Aimé Césaire, because I see his poster behind Marcos, and I was happy. I feel this reassurance of his thinking. And he, I think it's in Discourse and Poetry or Discourse in Colonialism, that he mentions this, the pre-scientific knowledge, which is the poetic knowledge. And I hear, for me, I understand his reference to pre-scientific knowledge. It is all these knowledges that they're presented as the objective truth, and this is how we should see the world. Whereas he finds poetry as this exact moment before this it is the pre-scientific. It is before the loss. It is before the elimination of the many and appropriation. And I think that why poetry? Because first of all, poetry is it's almost welcoming to anyone. Anybody can be a poet, as anybody can be a writer. But even poetry, because it connects you or connects one with the domain of emotions and the non-scientific, and could be also the domain of dreams. If we dissect for a moment Freud's interpretation of dreams, and we bring back to dreams not as an instrument towards analyzing our relationship to the world, but as a possibility of almost a parallel life of ours that defines also our relationship to language. And for me, I think I never faced that fear personally, although I'm trying to face fears. But of course, this is the fear I don't want to face, because it's too much frightening to face that one day you lose the ability towards language, to write or to speak. And sometimes I feel it. And I think writing becomes more and more painful with every day. It is the only profession that you get worse with time in doing it rather than better. And I feel how I'm getting worse and worse. And worse in a way that one becomes disfluent. You're no longer fluent. You no longer have this nonchalant relation to language, because the closer you get to language, you see its pains as well. You no longer use language. You depart from this relationship of instrumentalizing language to do something else, but becomes a life that you live. And you can undergo your own personal pain, the pain of others, you can see it. But what about the pain that is inflicted on the only source of life you have? And this goes back to planting words, to the books of Sekekini that have been looted in the aftermath of 1948 war. and the announcement, already before the announcement of the State of Israel, that was happened, the looting of the library took place 2 weeks before that, to date. It took place on the 30th of April, 1948. And understanding, trying to deal with this loss, what this loss meant to somebody like Sakakini, because all of his life was dedicated to language, to books, to words, to thinking with that. And he was a poet. He was never only a scientific theorist or researcher. He did amazing, he tried to write, or he wrote about education. He was a very important figure in the cultural scene in the whole Arab region, and not only in Palestine. And at the same time, he wrote poetry. And in fact, there is a fascinating moment that I go back to when he was arrested after the incident that is mentioned in Rhinoceros, where he's being arrested. He gets arrested and he's transferred to Damascus to be executed with Arthur Levine. And on the way, he's hungry, he's tired. They walk to South, which now is in Jordan, and then they take the train to Damascus. And in the train station, he meets one of his students. I get very emotional when I remember this. So he doesn't say anything to his student, but he recites a part of a poem, and the student replies in a poem. And I can also get in tears, because this is, it's beyond any pain, how poetry can engulf something that is beyond articulation and beyond the scientific. He doesn't go and tell his students what happened, and his students doesn't say anything. He just sees him with these Ottoman soldiers handcuffed, and all they have to each other, a line of poetry. So how you would find a place of this within the grand approaches or attempts of universalism, because it's something very specific, very private, very closed, but it opens up to something that is before anything else you can articulate. Really, like each time I read this, I am filled with tears, because it's something also beyond anything I can rationalize with. Because the line of poetry is not so interesting. It is, how is it said? So it doesn't have a function in its own. It doesn't have a meaning. It doesn't refer. It's not, and it's not instrumentalized for anything. It's not to tell something or to share in a domain of emotions that we expect from poetry to do. But it brought something completely new. And I'm very interested in these possibilities that they are never present or have been eliminated. On the other hand, is it only emotionally we can relate to it? And I question why I kind of become with lots of words, and I become very emotional when I remember that. And I wonder, maybe here also the limits of science and all the tools that are being offered by science.
Thank you, Adania. I would like to continue with the thematic field of the political invention of the nation state linked to the activity of collective writing. So literature, following the idea of the nation as an imagined community, as Anderson describes it, has played a major role in the formation of the model of the nation state in the 19th century. Your book, Minor Detail, shows us above all the violent consequences of building a nation state and of implementing borders where there haven't been any before. So how do you see the future of the nation state model? Are there perhaps other ways of shaping society? And to build a bridge to your concept of collective writing, doesn't it sound at first quite similar to the process of writing a national novel and constructing a nation state? Or asked the other way around, in which way does the concept of collective writing differ from the writing of the nation? Can the shift from the single author to multiple authors rather be seen as the creation of a different form of collectivity, as a kind of manual of togetherness?
Yes, the association of the novel or the imagined community, and which is often referred to as the grand national narrative. Sometimes you have this reference to certain novels or certain writers as the national writer. So my question is, they are so because of the form they are using, or how the form they are using can bring about this proposition of the national novel, the national writer. Because it can be a question of content, but you can do with the content just half or less. I don't know how much you can do with the content, actually. Because for me, it's not a main leading questions, as if it's almost the content is an excuse for the form. And yes, certainly, questioning the novel, the classical novel, and how Anderson speaks about it, it is a questioning of the role of the writer as the one who imagines and who can foresees. And I'm very interested in this kind of social imagination of what to include and what to exclude, and how this social imagination was brought about. I don't think there's one causing the other. It's not the novel that is the reason behind the nation state, or the nation state is behind the reason of the novel, but there's something. It's almost like, again, if we talk about a field, this is the things that are growing together, one influencing, one protecting the other. And it almost becomes an authoritarian as an idea of nation state and the national writer and the national novel, or the national poet for that reason. So how to relate to writing away from this position? And here I would like to refer actually to somebody whose work I've been fascinated with since childhood, and he's a poet and a prose writer. His name is Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri. He lived in the 10th, 11th century, when literature and poetry, Arabic poetry, was almost participating in writing history. It was almost this kind of narrative form that where you narrate events and almost like a storyteller, but in the form of poetry. And he's the one who tried to question that, this kind of the one voice, the voice of a poet. Because in these cases, it was known the poet as the most important figure, the figure that comes with power, and power, political power and poetry were very much aligned at this time. He was born in what is considered today as Syria, in a small town called Al-Ma'arra. And he became blind because he contracted chickenpox from the age of 4. And it's almost like this blindness is only allowed him to relate to language. It's not clear how much he remembered of what he saw before he got blind, but his life became dedicated to literature and poetry. And he tried this route. He went to Baghdad for a year. And he was known in his life as he's the fascinating, the poet, the coming future national poet, if we can talk about national at this time, because it's something different. But it is the poet who should be aligning himself and his poetry with the powerful elite. He, after 1 year, he left. He went back. He almost lived alone or with his dog. It's not clear. And he again went back to only writing. But what he wrote, it's almost this kind of discovery, going to Baghdad, experiencing all these amazing poets. But he goes back to his home in Al-Ma'arra, where he writes the Epistle of Forgiveness, Risalat al-Ghufran. That is the most fascinating exercise in collective writing. So the epistle imagines the afterlife. And this afterlife, it only has poets in it. And these poets are being punished based on how bad or good their poetry is. So he kind of brings all these poets that they were alive different times, and sometimes they are in hell because they misuse the word, or they changed the syntax and it was not allowed. And other times they went to heaven because they created something new and revolutionary. And reading that, you also see that he departed. He decided to leave this position of I, the writer. It is we, the writing together. And there is the whole, it's wonderful text that also thinks about language, and I would say kind of turns the idea of sin into a linguistic sin. It is, and I think not many people were happy with that text at the time, because of, the prophet becomes almost a literary critic. And so it goes, and and sometimes poets that they are supposed to be religious, they are really going to hell because of their terrible poetry. And poets who are known to drink and commit sins, but they at least didn't commit the sin of not seeing who they are. And I think this is very important note and that, because kind of recognizing the true self within the linguistic, the poetic, and how these intersect. And I think the collective writing, it recognizes the many possibilities of influences of words. And I go back to what I was saying, and I often say that the writer is almost vanishing, whereas I think the national novel brings the writer in the center. And departing from this centrality is very important. It's recognizing everything else that language allows to live within it. All these poems that are written in language, they're all coming together. They all inform us in a way that we disappear. It's not about the I or the you as a reader, I, the writer, and you as the reader. And also that's why I think I try not to say I am a writer. I never say I'm a writer. I say I write. And also I read. And within these activities, and often the collective writing is recognizing it is a proposal or kind of an attempt to acknowledge the multiple, the endless, the infinite words that they have their lives not with you, but with others. And I can also, with my work, I can trace it. Like sometimes when I think I can trace the life of each word before it landed in the novel. Whereas Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri, he does that with a full recognition of those writers who wrote. I recommend, this is a fascinating piece of work. If you have not read it, please kind of dedicate a few years of your life to read it in Arabic.
Thank you, Adania. I would like to take this collective writing question into actually a very concrete realm that we've been working on together as part of this exhibition project at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt together. But I'd like to do so via a little detour, because we've spoken so far about the relation of a certain number of institutions to modernity and universalism. So the institution of the nation, the institution of literature, writing, the novel, and so on. And one central civic institution that we've been grappling with quite fundamentally is the museum. The museum as an institution that is related, of course, to modernity and, of course, to the nation and so on. But I'd like to ask you more specifically whether we can consider, in your view, museums just as another form of narration, because of course they are themselves forms of architectural, political narration, but they also contain in exhibitions three-dimensional forms of narratives, which is one way of looking at exhibitions. And because we are working together on this question of how to exhibit, as it were, writing, collective writing processes in an exhibition and within museum-like institutions, I'm really curious whether you consider writing and exhibition making, writing at museums as altogether different forms of narration, or whether they're perhaps more related than we might think.
I mean, again, they come from the same field somehow, in terms of trying to construct a certain understanding. I mean, museum historically have been, created almost as a condition or precondition to imagine the nation state, to put the history of the nation as in terms of the object. And this goes back to the problem that I find even in the novel of instrumentalizing elements of our lives towards something else. But this doesn't mean that we should only relate to the museum how it has been created or how it has been used. And there are many important attempts and entries in kind of trying to think of a museum in a different way, not as a narrative, but as a space of questioning the inclusion and exclusion. For instance, what is there? And this is also the problem of what is there in a museum. There is the almost kind of unintentionally funny story with the Palestinian Museum in Palestine. I witnessed there is in kind of going back to the question of Palestine, trying to perceive or to address the pain that experienced by people in Palestine, Israel, and kind of trying to find also a nation state. It's almost like, okay, the pain created by a nation state can only be solved by a nation state or by thinking along these lines. And for me is the challenge how we can actually not mirror things, but try to take our thinking into something else, transform that source of pain, because I might be mistaken, but from my reading, I don't think any time nation states were a producer of good. But anyway, in the context of Palestine, so there are some attempts, I would say, non-imaginative attempts that are being supported by anyone who thinks nation state is important, to create the idea of the nation state of Palestine. And there's all these institutions that try that. So there was the idea, okay, if you are striving to build a nation state, a Palestinian nation state, so you probably would need a Palestinian museum. And on the opening day, there was nothing in the museum. It was not a concept. It was an outcome. And I think it's more interesting that it became it is the result of an outcome than a concept. Because it's almost you trying to imitate and follow the steps of all that leads to the nation state, but it's not possible. You cannot, and whenever you try, it's destined to failure. Not that you already said, okay, I am going to be questioning that already. And I think in that sense, it's interesting because it did not foresee, it did not dictate a new form. It ended up sincerely living to reach this point, an empty museum. But it was not empty, actually, because there was an opening, and it was filled with the people who came to see this museum. So I think it's a very interesting moment in thinking about museums. Also maybe thinking about ourselves, what we include, what we keep, and what we forget. And what do we think about when we also enter the space of a museum? What kind of ideas they come to form us and inform us? I think these are questions which are essential. I cannot enter a museum without feeling often of a hostility towards everything that is not included there. It's almost like a position of power, that which left to enter the museum. And I'm sure there are attempts to question this kind of threshold. What is being left out? And I think maybe I can relate to a museum as a space that includes, but then I want to see everything that is excluded from outside. And it's very interesting in the case of the Palestinian Museum, because sort of the question brought back then, because people felt in Palestine it's ridiculous and elsewhere, and it was a sign of joke, especially for Palestinians. But I think it was a joke not against the museum, but against oneself. Like, what are we trying to do? And even thinking, I heard some people say, but actually, yeah, it's not bad to have an empty museum and keep it empty. Because why? Because it's always going to be raided by the Israeli military at a certain point, and everything will be confiscated, which happens each time like Palestinians collect something. And it's very interesting about this idea of owning things, of property, and also of the global art market, because it is connected also to capitalism. And now investments are not only in oil, but mainly in artworks. So which role the museum had in that kind of process. And I would say, I go back to what Sekakini wrote about the loss of his books. He talks about that they are his books, and he says that I actually didn't inherit you, but you were collected by me. But he's not said that they are no longer his, but he is worried what future had become, or what destiny they have faced. For him, it's not about owning these books as much as respecting these books and transferring them honorably to libraries, to other libraries, or being destined to wrapping onions, as he writes in his farewell. So yeah, I'm kind of thinking what other possibilities when a museum is not possible to build or to create. And I think it opens to something that has been mentioned in the conversation about cultural appropriation and the appropriation of cultural heritage. And all this question that things will be protected in a museum, which is something that's not separate from the conversation and the discourse of museum. Because now, for instance, with the Benin bronze statues, not, you don't say statues, but yeah, the Benin bronze artifacts, that the whole discussion is like we are trying to build a museum for them before returning them, as if these artifacts that they have been part of their life, they can only exist in a museum, and they are in other countries because the museum is the place where they exist. Imagine like what we go and say, okay, nobody can use language unless they write a novel, because a novel is the form where language can exist. And otherwise we're gonna appropriate every word you say until you prepare for writing a novel. I will be happy as a reader, but I think turning that as a criterion, it relates these artifacts to power and to a certain relationship to them. And you often hear like about the Pergamon, that, or you find in text that goats were around and there's the manure of animals around, as if it's only if they are sterilized and in this kind of sterile environment, they get their own respect. And this kind of human centrality. Not that I'm saying this good or bad, but don't define how these lives suddenly, they only deserve one life and one gaze and one form of relation, which is only appreciation of the human. I don't mind goats going around. Actually, I like goats a lot.
Thank you so much, Adania. I think we're slowly coming to the end of the conversation, and I think this was a wonderful parcours where we had always, these two forms. I mean, these great institutions on the one hand that were sort of mirrors of our reflection, and then what became very clear is that your way of approaching writing, narrating things is rather from the other way around, right? From the narration, basically, from the interhuman way of telling things, from language, from experience. And so I would like to go back to that, to this biographical, but not in telling something about your life now, but rather about life in general. And that brings me to a story that you told us in our Minor Universality colloquium, which was fantastic. And we just thought we should, bring it back here also, which is the story you told about your ways of reading and how that was in the family. So you were telling that everybody was reading a lot. Your children were reading all of the time, and then often, as of the technical political situation, there were power breakdowns and the light was cut, so nobody would be able to read anymore. And then your brothers and sisters would gather with your mom, and she would tell you stories. And I think that is something that now brings all of these problems we have been raising now back to a very existential moment, where you think about narrating as something that is, against the silence, against the dark, or with it, or I don't know how to say that. I was wondering how to, ask my question, because there's so much things in that, the role of the mother, which is essential. The role of the parents of telling to the children something in these situations, the fact of gathering, of being together. And I was wondering whether this would rather tell a story about, the impossibility basically of narrating, or rather a way of narrating out of an impossibility. How would you say that?
Yes, certainly, or looking at the possibilities that they are still there and what you think is an impossibility. Because in this story, we're divided by my parents into those who read and those who don't read, with my father who reads, and he encourages us to read because also, it's more quiet to have the kids reading. They don't do anything, they just read quietly, which was a very smart kind of technique. Whereas my mother, she didn't read and write. And in that kind of constellation, she's excluded from this club of readers because we all would read and she wouldn't read. And then it's like all this issue of reading and not being able to read and to write, and the power relations are also embodied in that, because it's always about, enlightenment that comes with education, and education with schools and going, and then what do you do with the absence of that? So as if you should despise that, you should hate it, you should not respect it, you should think you are better than it. And then we all knew, and we all waited, we all kind of wished for this electricity break, because my mother is the best narrator of all these masters of literature. So it's almost the loss of the impossibility of somebody reading and writing. It's the most powerful, and also overpowers those who can read and write without the violence and without the negation. It's almost like there a possibility that you live without noticing it, but then with your loss, you remember that this is actually the best possibility. And I think we grew up with that, and it's very important, this realization of how there's almost a place for everything differently, and without difference being a source of a threat, but difference being a source of almost saving you. Because if we all were reading, we will never have the chance that my mom will tell us these amazing stories. And she truly, it's almost like Shahrazad, but Shahrazad that works in light and darkness. And this is a lesson of non-intrusion, of things not forcing themselves, and not coming with any violence, but almost in the moment that you encounter them. And it's very interesting sometimes when we kind of experience life and we learn and we discover without these hierarchies. And it's something very, I think personally, I'm also trying to explore a lot in my teaching life that you mentioned. I try to question the idea of the professor and the students, the university and outside the university, and what we are learning. And it's always a fascinating experience when this idea of transforming the space of knowledge from its limited university academic into something that is dynamically happening constantly without defining who gives what and who's legitimate to offer us knowledge. So in Palestine, we end up thinking from whom we want to learn and from whom we want to hear, which leads us to farmers, retired headmistresses, doctors, medical doctors, parents. And it's very funny because in the last time I did the course, students wanted to meet parents of someone. And allowing that, not excluding what is an accepted source of knowledge is fascinating. And it probably also can explain this relation to my mother, who didn't read and write, but who is the most amazing storyteller. And going back also even to Walter Benjamin and his text, The Storyteller, where he brilliantly actually, yes, I mean, Walter Benjamin is brilliant anyway, he doesn't need me to say brilliantly. And kind of trying to, he kind of really delineates how storytelling, what life it has, and how this life came to an end with writing, with the author, with the individual author who writes a text, and the text is there fixed. And the reading experience, it just finishes there the minute that you finish the book. That's it. You can remember the book, but you're not reading it anymore. Whereas storytelling kind of allows a shift, allows entries from places that we didn't expect. And I think also with knowledge, this academic knowledge, who decides that it is Kant who's going to tell us how we can lead change, as opposed to parents of somebody who telling us about change. And we are also doing this exercise in Switzerland, in Bern University, where I'm now teaching. And just realizing that the minute you leave the space of the classroom, the lecture hall, and the endless places that we can come and we are learning. Like 2 weeks ago, we were standing almost in the rain reading poetry in a cemetery. And this is how the class ends, or going to an old prison, or an observatory of stars. And so it moves in directions where these knowledges are opening us up, and how other experiences opening our knowledges and our readings of certain material.
Thank you so much, Adania, for opening definitely up our knowledge, and for this wonderful lesson, as you said, in the understanding exactly you gave of it. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and for this very deep and I think profound moment on narrating and on the human. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful.
Thank you all.